The fossil evidence for human evolution is extremely weak, and the case for human evolution is driven more by speculation based upon very sparse evidence than actual hard evidence. I'd say the main thing propping up the fossil evidence for human evolution is an undying belief in materialist ideology. So when you go to a museum or you read some National Geographic article that contains some artist depiction of a hominid species, you need to understand that they're constantly trying to make the ape-like species look more like humans and the human-like species look more like apes. And this is pure imagination and speculation. It's not based upon hard evidence. It's based upon trying to put forth this imaginary case for this transitional lineage leading to humans. In the popular mind, Neanderthals are often thought of as being very brutish and primitive. But the reality is that they have been discovered with signs of high intelligence, including art and culture. Quite a few paleoanthropologists think that Neanderthals buried their dead. And in fact, it's very surprising to learn that Neanderthals actually had an average brain size that is larger than that of modern humans. So there are many paleoanthropologists who believe that Neanderthals were highly intelligent. A classic example is Lucy. In fact, Lucy is representative of what we often find. Many people think that she is this complete skeleton of this beautifully preserved hominid, and she is, except that we only have about 40% of Lucy's skeleton. And when they first discovered Lucy's bones, they were scattered across a hillside. In fact, one of Lucy's discoverers said that it was very likely that in the next rainstorm, many of her bones might have been washed away. So one of the big questions relating to Lucy is whether or not this collection of bones that we assign to Lucy actually belong to only one individual or even a single species. So for example, a couple years ago, it was discovered that one of the bones that we include in this fossil that we name Lucy actually belonged to something like a modern ape and was certainly not from a hominid Australopithecine. So there's this question of whether or not the bones that we ascribe to Lucy actually belong to a single individual or even a single species. Now the classic rejoinder is that none of Lucy's bones in this collection of fossils appear duplicated, and that suggests maybe they do belong to one individual. But we don't really know that for sure, and it's difficult to make a clear-cut case that Lucy's fossil actually belonged to one single individual organism. So we often assume that when we see scientific diagrams of these hominid species, they're based upon very careful reconstructions based upon the bones that were actually found. But the bones that were originally found were often not in very good condition. For example, Lucy's pelvis, when it was initially discovered, was described as being badly crushed and having distortion and cracking. Now, of course, then the scientists come back to the lab and they reconstruct it and reinterpret it, but that interpretation is being guided by their evolutionary paradigm, which says that humans evolved from ape-like species. So they interpret Lucy as being this upright walking species with a pelvis that supports that interpretation, even though the original condition of the pelvis was not very good. So Ardi is another good example of a hominid fossil that needed extensive reconstruction because its initial condition was very poor. When Ardi's fossil was first discovered, reports said that it was initially soft or crushed or squished or chalky. Another report said it was nearly crushed to smithereens and needed extensive digital reconstruction. In fact, one report said that Ardi's pelvis, which is of course a very important bone for determining whether Ardi walked upright, was initially like an Irish stew. Of course, that does not inspire a lot of confidence about whether or not these fossil bones were actually in the condition we see in the scientific papers that depict Ardi as walking upright. The bottom line is that two of the most famous examples of supposedly upright walking ape-like human ancestors both initially were discovered with pelvises that were pulverized. So when we see in scientific papers or in the media these upright walking forms, that is based upon interpretation and imagination based upon their evolutionary views, not based upon the actual evidence that was dug up out of the ground. Homo naledi is a very famous hominid fossil that was discovered in 2015, reported by scientists in South Africa who discovered it in South Africa's cradle of humankind. One of the most exciting things about Homo naledi is the sheer number of bones that were found in the cave. Literally hundreds, if not over 1,000 bones were found. Now, the initial excitement among the evolutionary community was they hoped that Homo naledi would be this 2 to 3 million year old fossil that would fit right in the zone where evolutionary anthropologists believe that the genus Homo was evolving from the ape-like Australopithecines. But when they first reported Homo naledi, they had no actual geological age or date of the fossil. So they just assumed that it was 2 to 3 million years old. Well, then in 2017, they finally came out with an actual geological age for Homo naledi, and it was a real bust for the evolutionary viewpoint. It turned out that Homo naledi is only about 200,000 to 300,000 years old, not the 2 to 3 million years old that they were hoping it was based upon an evolutionary viewpoint. So basically, Homo naledi is about 10 times younger than it needed to be the human ancestor that the media claimed it was back when it was first discovered in 2015. In recent years, there are two fossils, both of which were discovered in South Africa, that have been claimed to be human ancestors. One of them is Australopithecus sediba, and the other is Homo naledi. Now, as you might imagine, if a species is an Australopithecine, it's going to be assumed to be more primitive and older and more ape-like than the one that belongs to the genus Homo. And incidentally, the same team of paleoanthropologists discovered both of these fossils and claim that both are human ancestors. But there's a problem with this evolutionary lineage that supposedly went from, say, something like Australopithecus sediba to Homo naledi to a more modern human-like form. And that is that Australopithecus sediba had a more human-like pelvis, teeth, and trunk than Homo naledi did. So if you're supposedly going from a more primitive ape-like condition to a more modern human-like condition, then these traits are evolving in the wrong direction, because you're going from a more human-like form to a less human-like form. So it's quite ironic that the same team of paleoanthropologists describe both of these fossils in different times, of course, as being human ancestors, when they really make sort of a nonsensical evolutionary lineage. When most evolutionary scientists, and certainly virtually all evolutionary paleoanthropologists, approach the evidence, they're not even asking the question, is it possible that these species were intelligently designed? They assume from the outset that there were only material causes involved in the entire history of life on Earth, and certainly the history of human origins. And so when they look at these fossils, they're not even questioning whether or not there is an evolutionary story behind these fossils. They are completely locked into an evolutionary mindset based upon a materialistic way of thinking, because that's the only kind of thinking they've ever been exposed to, and it's the only kind of thinking that is allowed within their paradigm. So they never even get to the question of whether the species might have been intelligently designed, whether or not the overall set of evidence supports an evolutionary viewpoint or points in some other direction. A materialistic ideology is completely guiding the way that they think, whether they even realize it or recognize it or not. So the term missing link is a term that is used very frequently in the popular discourse on evolution. Now, in the scientific community, the term missing link is not used very much. You can find it occasionally used in technical papers, but usually they'll talk about, are there transitions between ape-like species, such as the Australopithecines and the genus Homo? And I would say, rather than there being missing links, there are in fact missing fossils from the supposed transition. So there are missing transitions in the fossil record. In fact, there is a book that was written by 3 Harvard paleoanthropologists who talk about that during this time when the genus Homo was supposedly evolving from the Australopithecines, there was this gap in the fossil record. We don't see fossils that document this transition. We see Australopithecine-like fossils before this transition, and we see Homo-like fossils or human-like fossils after this transition. But when you actually look at when this transition supposedly took place, you don't see fossils that document this transition. So I would say we have missing transitions in the fossil record. If you pay attention to the way that the media covers human origins and human evolution, you'll see some patterns that repeat over and over again. Whenever a new fossil is discovered, it's promoted by the media as the latest proof of evolution. And the media kind of goes on this little mini crusade for Darwin with a lot of hype, hyping up these fossils as the latest evidence for human evolution. Well, what invariably happens is that after some time, this hype will die away and calmer and cooler heads will prevail, and you will see that scientists in the technical literature will begin to criticize the initial claims that this fossil was a human ancestor, and they'll say, well, maybe this fossil was actually not a human ancestor. Maybe it wasn't even related closely to human origins. So you almost always see this arc in the media when a new fossil is discovered. Initially, you see a lot of hype promoting these fossils, and then over time, that hype will die out, calmer and cooler heads will prevail, and it turns out that the fossil probably was not a human ancestor after all. And there's another point that we need to keep in mind, and that is that the overall pattern in the fossil record is not one that shows slow, gradual Darwinian change from one species into another. Instead, the fossil record shows a pattern of explosions, where we see lots of new types of organisms and forms appearing abruptly, without evolutionary precursors. That's true throughout the fossil record, and it's certainly true for the origin of our genus Homo. You may not remember this, but back in May of 2009, it's very possible that one morning you woke up, turned on your computer, went to Google, and found that instead of the usual Google logo there was a little logo of a small, cute, furry mammal. That mammal was called Ida, or Darwinius malisae, and at the time it was being heavily promoted in this sort of coordinated effort between the media, TV stations, scientific community, and of course major websites like Google trying to promote evolution to the public. They were calling Ida the link that connects us to the animal kingdom. Well, it turned out later that Ida was actually not a human ancestor. It was most likely an ancestor or something related to lemurs, and it was certainly completely distantly related to the human line. But the story of Ida, what it shows us, I think quite amusingly, is how the scientific community and the media will work together to push evolution on the public, kind of getting ahead of the facts and not letting the facts speak for themselves. They want to evangelize the public for Darwin without really asking carefully, does this evidence truly support an evolutionary view of human origins?